Okay.
I'm tense because I'm looking for a section to read. I didn't expect I would have to read.
Excuse me, this is my first time.
Sorry?
I said it's my first time, so you guys enjoy. Enjoy me, I will enjoy you. Yeah. I think people are wanting the link. I haven't sent
Yes, same with me.
anybody a link. So
Yeah, a lot of people are asking me for the link also.
I couldn't access the opening this afternoon. Was there a
Yeah.
problem?
What is that?
Okay.
I love your throw, Kosi. It's so beautiful. Or is it a
Between being cold and hot.
oh?
So I thought I need to have it here in
Have it
case I
handy.
get too cold. Thank you.
Hmm.
Mhm. Yeah. Good afternoon, everybody. Here we are at the 26th time of the Writing Fest. And so fortunate to have in our midst two acclaimed writers who are novelists, researchers, poets, academics in literature. They bring to us the life stories of Noni Jabavu, who was born in 1919 and died at the age of 89 in 2008, and the life of Loretta Ngobo, born in 1931 and was deceased at the age of 84 in 2014. Her historiographies are brought to life by Nkosazana Xaba and her co-writer Atambile Masola and Professor Barbara Boswell. Tonight is your time, writers, your time to first tell the avid readers and listeners about yourselves before we go into your compilations of Noni Jabavu, A Stranger at Home, and Loretta Ngobo, Writing as the Practice of Freedom. So who do we start with first? I think it would be you, Nkosazana. So can you tell us more about yourself, Nkosazana?
Well, the self that is important for tonight's session is the fact that I'm a writer. I've published one book of short stories called Running and Other Stories, and I've published 4 books of poetry. I also compile anthologies on short stories and poetry. The most recent compilation is called Our Words, Our Worlds, Writing on Black South African Women Poets, which came out in 2019, which is a compilation that's in 3 sections where literary scholars talk about the work of Black women poets, and poets write on themselves, their journeys as poets, and I did some interviews with quite a number of them. So yeah, in summary, that's who I am.
Okay. And you, Barbara?
Hello, Sam. Thank you so much for hosting us. Hello, Nkosazana Xaba. It's an honor to be in conversation with you both. I'm Barbara Boswell, and I'm a writer also. I'm the author of a novel, Grace, and a scholarly work called And Wrote My Story Anyway, Black South African Women's Novels as Feminism. I'm a scholar, a storyteller, a teacher. I teach Black women's writing and Black women's literature and post-colonial literature at the University of Cape Town.
So we're in for a treat as to, especially these 2 books that you've come out with. Your research seems so amazing. And my first question to you would be, out of all the Black women writers, I'm thinking about Joyce Sikekani, Sophie Tema, Suzette Mafuna, Bessie Head, Barbara Masekela, out of all of them whom you have read, so why did you choose these particular Black women writers as your subject matter? And I think we'll start again with Nkosazana.
I chose Noni because when I first read her first book, which I found in a second-hand bookstore, drawn in color, I was very surprised because I had never heard her name, let alone, read about her through somebody else. So I found the book in 2001 and I read it, and I remember thinking, wow, this book feels like it could have been written about my parents. There was a connection that I felt with the book that made me think, wow, that's interesting. As somebody who reads a lot, I had never read a book that felt so close to me. The books that I had read before were just books, and I'm interested, so I read. So when I started doing research on her, I just couldn't find anything. There wasn't a single thing online that year on Noni Jabavu. So I got curious. But it wasn't until 2004 when I was doing my master's in creative writing, and we had to write an essay under the biography genre section of the class. We had to write an essay about anybody. And the essay's framing was a day in the life of. And I remember thinking, oh, okay. Noni Jabavu had come back the following year after I had read the book. She came back in May of 2002. And I thought, remember you couldn't find anything on her. Now you know she's back. Why don't you write a day on the life of? So I set out to write an essay on Noni's return to South Africa on the 5th of May, 2002. And the essay ended up being structured around questions that I had that I couldn't answer about her return. And that's how the journey of my interest in her began.
Okay. Well, we're going to learn a little more about her just now. And you, Barbara, what sparked it off?
Yeah, it's very hard to come and to quantify why we or qualify why we become obsessed with certain subjects. I was sitting with a colleague of mine, Victoria Collis Buthelezi, in Johannesburg when we heard that Loretta Noble had passed away. And we both were scholars of her work. I had taught Loretta Noble's work in the United States and in South Africa, and I've also written about her for my dissertation, for my research on Black South African women writers. And when we heard that she'd passed away, we looked at each other and said, oh, another Black woman writer who is going to fade into obscurity, because that's what tends to happen with Black women writers. And at that moment, both of us decided that we would edit a special collection on Loretta Noble's life and legacy for a literary journal, and we did that. And so I had the opportunity, I was actually commissioned by HSRC Press to write, to compile this biography of any person that I wanted. And so I decided to do it on the subject of Loretta Noble, talking about her life and including some of her writing. Because when I had spoken to her for my research on a return from exile, it was many years after return from exile, actually. She was in exile for 31 years. She was quite wistful about the fact that she was better received abroad by audiences. She was invited, feted, but in South Africa, she wasn't known. And I think that is part of why I became very enamored with the subject of Loretta Noble, her life, her legacy, all of her writing. She wrote in many different genres, and she was a brilliant writer who I think is understudied, not known, and underappreciated.
Okay. And I suppose, yes, I think I was fortunate in meeting Loretta. And I was glad that I was able to write the foreword to her book, The Prodigal Daughters. And of course, it was very sad for us when we found that she had passed on. Yeah, and it's true when they say that it is important that let's take these writers out of obscurity. And I think that's the word that I was looking for earlier on. I think it was Noni who said, please take me out of obscurity so that people can read me. And it will be interesting to find out why did you come up with those titles? First with A Stranger at Home, Makosazana, and then Loretta's books called Writing as a Practice of Freedom. How and why did those titles come up? Makosazana first.
Yeah, well, this book is introduced by Atambile Masola and I. And I want to underline introduced. It's not our book. It's a compilation of the columns that she wrote in 1977 when she was in South Africa. And the columns were published in the Daily Dispatch newspaper in East London at Donald Wood's invitation, who was the editor at that time. So I had read earlier, before meeting Atambile, from a compilation of personal letters to her friend that she had met in Kenya. I had read that she was keen on putting the columns together into the book. And I write in the introduction of this book that she had said that she had written the column deliberately in a very personal, kind of casual style. And she had been hoping that she would put them together into a book with a more literary style, a slightly more formal style. So I remember reading that and thinking, oh my gosh, we need to put these columns together. At that time, it was an I, because I had met Atambile. And one of the things we discussed once Atambile and I met was, let's look at these columns. And so that was the interesting thing about the columns, because the title then comes from one of the things she says in her experience of being in South Africa after so many years. I mean, she left in 1933 to study there. She had come in 1951 when her mother died, come back in 55 when the brother died, and then in 77 and 76 when she was coming to do some research on her father. She was planning to write a biography of her father. So in the columns, she writes a lot about what it felt like to be home, yet feel like a stranger, because she wasn't as practiced as some of us were who grew up under apartheid about how to live your life in the world, you know, of apartheid, when you know you can't go into that store, you can't go to that library, you can't get into that bus, you know. So a lot of what she was experiencing in 1977 was that being a stranger, yet being at home, because she didn't know and understand the rules. And even when she was told them, they didn't make any sense, because the nitty-gritties of apartheid's spatial geography was just not familiar for her. She had left South Africa when she was 13. And each time when she came in the years that I mentioned earlier, it was brief, for a funeral, for a visit to this family, and then she was gone. But for this time, she was living her life, doing the research on her father. And simple things like she couldn't be in the same homeland for more than 3 months. You know, that was ridiculous for her. So the choice of the title captures that, you know, what it meant for her to be back in South Africa and feel like a foreigner.
Yeah. So that's quite apt, to be a stranger in one's own home. And then what happened to her later on, as she progresses, we'll get to know a little more from you in terms of her writing. And Loretta, writing as a practice of freedom, why that title?
Yeah, the title comes from something that she said in an interview, where she was talking about the second novel that she wrote. Her first novel was called Cross of Gold, and when it was published, a lot of the feminists who were part of her community in exile in London apparently criticized her, saying that, you know, the one strong woman character in the novel dies early on. And so she wrote her second novel and named it And They Didn't Die. And when we spoke about the process of writing this novel, she reflected and said, you know, come to think of it, as I wrote freedom for this character of mine, I was writing freedom for myself, because in her liberation came my liberation. And I thought that was quite a profound comment. And I think the title then gestures to the ways in which writing can be liberatory for women. in that it allows us to cross boundaries, transcend certain roles that we are given. It allows us to imagine different futures, and it allows us to just think and on a very broad scale and reach broad audiences. And I think this is what her work continues to do.
Well, they were very fortunate in being away, and that being away from the restrictions of an apartheid society and being in exile would have brought a number of privileges and opportunities that they would not have experienced had they been in South Africa at those particular times in history. So can you tell us a little more about how did these opportunities give them openings to pursue their writing careers? Well, Nkosazana, I think I'm going to ask you first. So can we always be Nkosazana first and then you, Barbara?
When Noni left in 1933, she left with a family, a woman called Margaret Clark and a man called Arthur Gillette, who were a couple and Quakers, and they lived in Oxford. And they had following the conversations with the parents, there was an agreement that she would be sent to Mount School in York in the north. And the idea was that because Mount School was a girls' school, it would be best suited for her because, as we know, girls-only school have tended to be very supportive of girls when they're not having to compete with boys. And, so that's where she was sent. So during holidays, she would come back to Oxford to be with her, what she calls my foster parents. So here's an opportunity then to be at a girls' school in Mount York, north of UK. And when you think about her contemporaries at the time, which schools would they have been at? That becomes a question. So when she finishes high school, she goes to the Royal College of Music to study music, and then World War II breaks out. And we now know that most countries made sure that women were part of the war when World War II happened, and she happened to be amongst the women who were in a munitions factory, a factory that was putting together arms. Now, I haven't found a lot of information on what exactly she did there and what friendships she made and how she thought about that time. She just writes about the fact that she did do that. But what I imagine when I read that is, wow, she would have been exposed to so many other women. They would have been talking about whatever they needed to talk about, which was what it meant to be women in a factory that was making arms for the war. What was this war about for them? Did it mean anything? And at what level did it mean anything? And what was that anything? So that's what I imagine as somebody who's trying to put together somebody's life. And the summary that I come up with is that was a lot of good exposure in terms of thinking about what it means to be part of the world war and making arms as women. Now, whether it was positive or negative, I don't know. Point is, it was exposure. I don't know what she would say about it herself. So the war finishes and she goes back to a different to university, but it's a different one. She's at Birmingham. And then I read somewhere that in January of 1942, she does her first show on the BBC radio. Now, when you think about South Africa in 1942, what radios were available at that time and who of her peers would have been in radio. So she continues doing this work until 1963. She's not there full time, but she's on and off. But again, that was very interesting exposure because what happens in that period as well is that the women who are working in the BBC are fighting for space, for room, for programs to be inclusive of women. And there ended up being a book that was written about a program that they had motivated for called the Women's Hour. So maybe Noni wasn't part of those conversations because she wasn't full-time, but she was impacted by those decisions that were later made about the significance of having a Women's Hour on radio. Years later, in the late 50s, she's doing some programs for the Women's Hour. So yeah, there's a lot I could say, but let me stop there for now.
I think what would be interesting is that she's the first woman editor of a magazine, the Strand magazine in London. And how did that come about?
Okay, so that happens in 1961. Again, I don't have yet the details of how she was recruited. All I know is that she was appointed and started working there in September of 1961. And this magazine had been in operation since the late 18-somethings, and it closed down in the 50s. So this was a resuscitation effort, and they chose her because in that moment, she had become very prominent because her first book had come out in 1960. So clearly people had read the book and, they thought, oh, wouldn't it be lovely for this resuscitation effort to have this kind of personality? And so that's what she does from September of 1961 until the end of April in 1962.
Okay. And what would you say about the opportunities, or if there was any, for Loretta, Barbara?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It was a double-edged sword for her exile, I think, because of mainly the way in which she left, and her early exile was quite a traumatic experience from her telling of it. And she writes about that extensively in an edited collection called Prodigal Daughters, South African Women's Experiences in Exile, which she edited and collected essays by other women, including her own story. So she went into exile. I mean, her husband, A.B. Ngcobo, was a founder member of the Pan-Africanist Congress. And at the time when she went into exile, he was in prison in Pretoria. He was on trial for treason. And she was a school teacher in Durban, working at a high school, and was under surveillance by the special branch, and was aware that she's being followed, and had 3 small children, and was aware that if she got arrested, her 3 children would have both parents in prison. And so she decided overnight that she would leave, she'd go into exile, and left overnight without telling anyone, without saying goodbye to her children or her mother or her brother with whom she lived at that time, and went into exile into Swaziland. And there she had a really difficult time because she was reunited with her 2 younger daughters a few months later. Her mother was able to bring them, but they lived in abject poverty there for a while. It was only a few years later that they settled in England, in London, with A.B. Ngcobo. He was able to join, and the family reconstituted itself. And that is when the opportunities, I think, opened up to her. She was a head teacher at the Tufnell School. She taught very young infants, not infants, but young children. And at that time, she had 3 daughters, and she had to carve out time to write. But it provided stability. There wasn't the police harassment, the political harassment at that point. And so she was able to, in 1969, I think, start really writing in earnest. And she also had community. She had other Black women writers around her who were immigrants or second generation immigrants, and she worked amongst them. And she also provided a space for them in the publication of Let It Be Told, Black Women British Writers. That was another edited collection where she amplified women's voices. So she was very much a writer for other writers also, and for bringing their stories into fruition. So there were many opportunities. Once she published Cross of Gold in 1981, her first novel. She received a level of stature in the literary world that saw her invited all over the globe. And she traveled a lot. She was a sought after speaker. She also went to lots of book fairs, and she went to conferences, and she spoke a lot about South Africa's plight under apartheid and being a writer, a Black woman writer, an African woman writer. So her beginning years as an exile were extremely difficult. And then later on, the opportunities opened up to her, other women writers, feminists, travel. And I think being in exile in London specifically afforded her many opportunities that she, one doesn't know how her life would have panned out otherwise, but it's impossible to tell. But that was a springboard from where she could maneuver and work as a writer.
Well, I think then it follows up from Makosazana. That follows up from what your co-author Atambile Masola says. She writes that if one has to understand in terms of Noni, one has to understand Noni's beliefs, one must understand her life. And in so doing, we see what Loretta, her beliefs came from. But I would also go further to say that the way each of them lived their lives also affected their writing. So from their backgrounds now, you can see that it's clear that Loretta had a strong Pan-Africanist influence. Whilst Noni, on the other hand, is it true to say that she had a strong liberal Afrikaner English upbringing? And did it in any way, both their backgrounds affect or impact their writing?
Acknowledgement section of her first book, Drawn in Color, she writes, I belong to two worlds with two loyalties, South Africa, where I was born, and England, where I was educated, which is an interesting way to position oneself, because I think what she was doing there is to own the fact that she was born and raised in South Africa until she was 13. And she was educated in the UK, that's for sure, but she uses the words belong and loyalties, which I thought was very interesting. But when we go back to where she was born in Alice at Fort Hare in 1919. The university at that time is called the South African Natives College. It had started in 1916, and her father is lecturing there with Alexandra Kay, and they're the first two lecturers. And her mother is responsible for the dormitories. So what does it mean to think back to that time? And you're born into a campus where the world is right at your doorstep, right? When she talks about what it meant to have all the people who were teaching with her father at home and the conversations that were heard, and she listened into, even though she was a daughter, it was clear that the world was, she was brought into a family where the world, she could see the world because of how she was positioned. So the fact that she leaves also has to do with how the family was positioned as a family of the world. Both her parents had also studied abroad. And the start of Fort Hare, when you read about the history of how Fort Hare was started, it is her grandfather who was one of the people who had done the work of fundraising for the university. So all this to say, she's born into a family that already has that kind of worldly history, if you like, for that time, and she takes that for granted. So going over to study in the UK to finish off her high school is her continuing to belong to the world because that is what she was used to. Now, she does suggest in one of the columns that she wasn't quite prepared for it. I mean, she doesn't say it in so many words, but she wasn't quite prepared as a child. It was just the parents saying, it's time for you to go. You're going to get an education. These are your parents, you know, and so on and so forth. But I'm making this point to say that there's something about, you use the word liberal. I don't know how quite to use that, which isn't to say I disagree. But the point I want to make is that it's a very different way of being to be a child and see the world right in your home, to being an adult who decide I'm going to engage and adopt this kind of politics and I'm going to call myself this kind of person. That's a very different thing. So she is shaped by the world in her family of her birth, and she continues to live out in the world and continues to, as the columns show, travel a lot. So she just becomes the human being of the world, even though she captures herself as being of two worlds. My reading of her, and it comes out in those columns, is that she was of the world, which was bigger than the two worlds that she says she had loyalties to.
Okay.
Have I answered the question?
Yes, very much so, because we will come up later on when we talk about how she defines herself in terms of her identity, in terms of her writings. And coming back then to Loretta, did her Pan-Africanist background impact her writing?
I think yes, it did in an extent, but I think to an extent, but far more what she wrote about and spoke about in interviews far more was her foundation. This she was born in Iklopo in Natal province, and was born in quite a rural area, and was surrounded by women and a kind of culture of storytelling all the time, stories being told, poems. Each child in the family had their own poetry that was recited to them, and she goes back to that quite a lot in her own writing about her life and her influences as a writer, and how she was nurtured in this culture of storytelling. And then, of course, she had her parents were educators, and her grandparents also were quite educated, and insisted that she go to Inanda Seminary. So she matriculated, and she loved that setting because she read a lot. She was in boarding school. It was a vibrant setting for her. It stimulated her intellectually. It stimulated her writing, and also then very atypical for a woman her age, went to Fort Hare University. And she describes being one of maybe a handful of women in classes that were filled with men, and how they were condescended to, and even by professors, were treated like the professors were doing them a favor by having them in the classrooms. And so I think that those were very foundational moments or forces in her life, because she realized as a child that there was sexism that was silencing all these powerful women around her that were matriarchs and that were really doing a lot in terms of running everything, but when decisions were being made, their voices were silenced. And then she was centered as a girl in an all-girls school again. There's that commonality. It was a very rich environment, but then found again when she went to Fort Hare, her gender identity, she was looked at as a woman and treated as a second-class citizen, as a woman by the men at Fort Hare. And so those are quite animating forces in her writing, and especially in And They Didn't Die. She wanted to write a novel about the plight of rural African women under apartheid, what the Bantustans did to them, and also that they resisted. They had agency, they fought back, they were not silently accepting of their oppression. They resisted in very multiple ways, which she documents in that novel, by burning passes, by having those beer hall protests in Durban, for example, in the 50s. Those are all fictionalized in that novel. So those are, to my mind, some of the major influences. I think her collective consciousness and a Pan-Africanism is perhaps demonstrated best in the works that she edited, the edited collections, the two I already mentioned, Prodigal Daughters, which is about South African women in exile, and Let It Be Told, Black Women Writers in Britain. So with these collections, these were not fiction, these were people's life stories that she encouraged them to tell in order to publish them in these collections. And worked with them, I think, as an editor, developing some of the voices, developing a coherence to each edited collection. And I think in those instances, she was very aware of diversity and people's different locations and what it meant to articulate jointly as oppressed women in those specific venues, the collections that she created for them.
Okay. So they you come back to South Africa, and for them it was a culture shock, would you say? And what were some of the stark everyday challenges they had to contend with, especially being the outsider looking in on the conditions they witnessed from, I would say, a privileged lens? So when they got back, there was this, wow, what happened? So can you tell us what were some of the challenges they had to contend with on their return?
Yeah, in these columns, she talks a lot about that and how apartheid's spatial geography affected where you slept, how you traveled, how, in one of the columns, for instance, she tells a story of how she was needing to meet up with a friend who was white, and that in itself became a huge challenge because she's at this hotel, but she can't be in the bus that's going to take her to. So most of what she talks about in these columns is the difficulty of living your life in an everyday kind of way because of apartheid, and how sometimes Black people would listen to her and they could immediately tell that she wasn't South African, and how that would, end up, and how sometimes she'd be so excited just listening to people speaking in the Xhosa that she grew up with. So it was a number of things. And for instance, in one of the columns, she responds to what one of the writers had said, that she's a snob. And so she says, am I a snob? And she talks about that. So, yeah, I don't know which one I can delve into. Yeah, but there were many. It was just about how life at an everyday basis was a challenge because of the way that apartheid operated.
for Loretta,
Yeah, so
I-
Loretta, go ahead.
yes, how did she face the hazardous situations that she was faced with in terms of a cultural shock? What
Right.
did she face?
They were in exile for 31 years and returned in 1994. Loretta and her husband, A.B. Noble, and some of their children, but not all of their children who were adults at this stage. So, there were multiple challenges for them. She was very excited to be back. She was exhilarated. She writes columns for literary journals about her first time voting and how exhilarating that was. And then she says, it's the column's called Now That We Are Free, and it's in the book. But there are cautions. So she talks about, these sunset clauses that have been written into agreements during the transition and the negotiated settlement, and people retiring with golden handshakes who really have committed some of the foulest atrocities during the apartheid era. So she's got a very interesting eye as an observer, because she's an outsider and she comes in and she can pick up, I think, on things that perhaps someone who has been embedded in the society wouldn't necessarily. She also writes a lot about gender relations and how concerning it is, and for example, how a woman who was a neighbor in the rural setting near Ulundi, where they were staying, sometimes was murdered and accused of witchcraft. And so she's excited and exhilarated by freedom, but taking in all these warning signs that things are not quite 100%. We're not quite fully free, because women are being murdered here. And they are not young women or white women. They are particularly Black, working class, older women who are being accused of witchcraft and murdered very brutally. So she's aware of all these issues, and they are disturbing to her, and she writes about it. The other thing, because they were a political family and a political couple, and A.B. being a founder member of the PAC, during exile, there had been a split, and he was no longer part of the leadership of the PAC. I think when he returned home, there was an attempt to become more powerful within the party, but ultimately he didn't succeed in that. And so they were political people, and they joined the IFP, the Inkatha Freedom Party, at that point, both of them. And she, in fact, then later in 2007, no, it's not in 2007, it's earlier, but she becomes a provincial member of parliament of the KwaZulu-Natal legislature for the IFP herself. So it's a very interesting time for her. She also talks about the impact that being back has on her writing, because in England, her time is very protected. It's a different kind of culture, but in South Africa, people drop in at any time without calling, without saying we're coming, they just come. And it's a very it's a very different type of social scene, and there were a lot of demands made on her. She was teaching at a training college again when she arrived, before she went into formal politics. And she felt that she had been sidelined in literary circles because she was not aligned to the African National Congress. And she was very clear about that she's not being invited to writers' conferences and those kinds of events because she was not of the dominant political party, and because she was aligned to the IFP. So she struggled with that, and again expressed that as a writer she felt more recognized abroad than in our hometown, and there was a kind of sadness about that.
Well, there are so many issues in both books. I think I just want to hone in because we don't seem to have time. Like Makosazana said, this really, the two books would be a discussion for over 3 hours. But I want to just hone in on to this idea of the feminist side of feminist writings. And so each of the writers appear to have been writing around feminist consciousness, both at a personal level and at a political level. But Noni, in some instances, often denies the label of being political or feminist. Makosazana, were you convinced of these claims? And for you, Barbara, did you find in the trajectory of Loretta's writings that she showed strong leanings towards becoming a Black feminist writer? So can we have your views on that?
So when you ask the question, was I convinced of these claims? I want to laugh because how people choose to label themselves is completely up to them. And how we read them, whether we're reading their writing or we're reading the claims, changes somewhat sometimes. So I want to say that as an opener, because the point I want to make goes back to what I was saying earlier, that she was born into a family that was the microcosm of the world, and she ends up living in the world. So there's a lot of things that she takes for granted. There's a lot of things that she doesn't have to fight for. And as I was saying earlier, when the BBC women were fighting for the Women's Hour within radio, she ends up in that slot automatically. When you use the word liberal, and I want to use the word she uses, which is being middle class, and sometimes she calls it upper middle class, there are certain privileges that you take for granted when you are born into a space like that and you live in a world like that. Because often the labels that we choose, I call myself a feminist because I've had to fight for it, okay? I've had to fight for women's rights. And so I choose to use that word. But it's easy for me to see and to conclude that she didn't have to claim any of these things because of how she was raised, where she was raised, and where she grew up. So when she writes, even though we might read, for instance, the editorials that she writes for the New Strand magazine, one would interpret it would be possible to interpret them as being very, very feminist because she's writing about herself. She is in her head thinking about, what does it mean to take on this role? I've never been an editor. Am I going to be doing it right? What does it mean to say no to short stories when this magazine was known for short stories? So there's a very deliberate way in which she is reflecting on her role. Now, somebody might say that's because she was a feminist. Would I take that away from them? No, because feminism has been known to do that. But she chooses not to use that word for herself. And for her, it was just, oh, okay, yes, I've written for newspapers. Yes, I've been on radio. I've written a memoir. Can I be an editor? What does it mean to, engage with people and their work and give them feedback and all of that? I don't know if I'm making the point clearly, but I think in summary, I want to say that there's something about being middle class that allows you to take for granted a lot of privileges that you experience and you live with in your life, that you don't have to, if you choose not to, claim a particular label. And I can imagine that being in the UK for that long, living in Uganda and Kenya, where there was a lot of talk about what it meant to be liberated as Uganda in 1957. She had lived there before Uganda was liberated, but she's not part of the conversations in that deliberate way where she's about, okay, Africa must be liberated from, the colonizers. So all this to say, I think my conclusion on why she chooses to not use those words is because she had experienced the world and taken a lot of things for granted, and the privilege that came with the family that she was born into and living her life in the world from that young an age.
Yes, they had the opportunity of traveling, both of them had the opportunity of traveling through England. While being in England, they traveled to the Caribbean, to America, to Europe, and then parts of Africa, and then they returned to South Africa. Throughout writings, there's been different intersectional oppressive levels that they had experienced. And it must have been quite tough coming back to South Africa. But going back to this whole idea of feminist writings, how did Loresta feature?
Yeah, she certainly had a feminist consciousness and a consciousness around gender equity and intersectional feminist struggles. She's claimed by feminist critics and feminists like myself, who have put her in that category as feminist literature, or a feminist writer. She, especially in And They Didn't Die, it's very, very clear that she is conducting an intersectional, she takes an intersectional approach to describing and representing African women's oppression, because she talks about them as being caught between the forces of tradition and traditional patriarchy and apartheid, the economic system that exploits them. So she's very clear, and she shows that in that novel all the way, how apartheid and patriarchy, African patriarchy, actually intersect to oppress these women. She shows very clearly the consequences in those women's lives. She writes about gender. She writes about the women's movement in South Africa when she returns from exile, and talks about the huge racial divides within the feminist movement, and how extremely difficult those divides are going to be to overcome. And does a very clear and cogent analysis of the problems besetting the movement. She also, when she was a politician formerly in the provincial legislature, she chaired the portfolio committee on gender. And so she was very, very much in her writing, in her praxis, in her ways of including other women and bringing them to voice through publishing them, through her political work. She was quite feminist in her articulations.
Yeah, and for me, when it came to Noni, when she wrote in the Daily Dispatch, and at the most critical and most crucial times, 1976, 1977, the time when Mapetla Mohapi had passed on, Steve Biko had passed on, but somewhere along the line in her columns, I was just wondering, did she ever in any way articulate what she felt about the conditions of that time and how it affected her?
Besides the everyday examples that she gives in the columns, no, she doesn't. But does this mean that she didn't have an opinion? Of course not. One of the things she says a lot, she mentions a lot in the columns is, well, maybe not in the columns, in the letters that I have when she writes to her friends, is how she needs to be deliberate about putting aside content that she will put in her memoir, in her autobiography, actually, because she was also not only was she doing research towards her father's biography, she was working towards her own biography. And her father's, she was calling what did she say? I can't remember, but she was working on her own autobiography, and she was very deliberate about what she was going to keep for that autobiography. So yes, it doesn't show up in the Daily Dispatch, but I don't know, haven't found any notes towards the actual manuscript of her own autobiography. So I don't know if she wrote about that. My suspicion is that she does, but we don't know. Until somebody finds the manuscript, we can't really tell. Because remember that she was also recruited by Donald Woods, and we know the story about what ended up happening to Donald Woods soon after Steve Biko died. And what conversations do we imagine she had with Donald as she was preparing her columns? We don't know, right? So the fact that she doesn't comment on the columns that were published is not necessarily something that leads us to a conclusion that she wasn't political, if you know what I mean.
So yes, and that frames what we were talking about earlier on. I don't think we have much time. And I just want you to conclude very quickly with, I don't think we have time for you to even read an excerpt, but if you wanted to give us a glimpse into one aspect of Nonnie's and one aspect of Loretta's lives that will remain in your memories and that would stir our audiences to want to buy your books, what would it be?
I think for me, it's her sense of freedom. Because it wasn't, when I read the way she's written and I read about her biography, about her family history, I conclude that she was born free. And that for me is something that is quite important for, one, those times, two, a Black woman in South Africa. What you call her liberal politics is she's born into an upper middle class family that just allows her to be free. And she leaves at 13 when, as most teenagers, I mean, it was only in very highly violent political periods in this country that people were politicized in their teens. But under normal circumstances, you know, people are upper teens, early 20s when they become political and they explore this and explore that. But there's something about just being born free that for me is quite, when I think about it, I feel like she was lucky. And that's the word that comes to mind, that she was lucky to have been born in that family where she could take so many things for granted and move around the world the way she moved. And I think it's kind of sad because she had always wanted to come back to South Africa. But for the longest time, she couldn't because she was married to white men. And by the time she comes back, she's not healthy. She's just happy to be back home. But she's in a frail care center because that's how unwell she was. So there's a sad note to it, but the fact that she had just been born free and lived in the world like there were no worries, for me is an interesting message to take away from her life story, because most of the life stories about Black women that we read about and want to talk about is struggle and strive and pain and trauma. Now, it isn't to say she never had any pain or trauma, but just broadly speaking, there's something about a life lived freely that for me is quite interesting in the story of her life and for the times.
And for you, Barbara, what would stand out about Loretta's life?
That she accomplished so many things and played so many roles and still was writing throughout it. She was a mother, she was a teacher, she was the head of the school eventually where she taught in England. She was an activist, an educational activist for an organization of educators in the Caribbean and England and Africa, and she represented them globally. She was a fantastic writer, very talented. She worked on her craft diligently throughout all of that. Came back to South Africa after 31 years in exile, and then became a politician. And in her 80s she started editing this Prodigal Daughters. You know, she was still giving other women the space and creating the circumstances, enabling other women to be published. And I think she had a phenomenal energy that enabled her to do all these things and fulfill all these roles, play all these roles, and excel at each of them. And I think she also had a very deep thirst for justice, which was the underlying force. So those are just some of the qualities that I think come through in her writing, and is why you should read her work, buy her books, and enjoy this wonderful, wonderful writer.
Well, I think we're coming to an end now. And I want to thank both of you. Both of you are so amazing in your compilations, as researchers, as writers as well. And I can only say to the center that they should invite you to Durban, where you can launch your books, and that we can have a feast of your thinking and of the way we would like to see Black women being put out, not on the margins anymore, but right out there where they should be recognized. I would like to say thank you very much, and I think that leads us to the end. Yeah, thank you.